Hey everyone, I'm Brian Varnell with Varnell Retro Vintage Collections, and welcome to episode 2 of the James Bond Jr. podcast. Today I'll be talking about episode 1 of the series entitled The Beginning. I'll also be talking about issue number 1 of the Marvel Comics, also called The Beginning. Now, before I go into the episode, I want to talk a little bit about the behind the scenes. The episode aired on September 30th, 1991. I didn't mention this in the previous episode, but the series was developed by Michael G. Wilson and Robbie London. Michael G. Wilson is actually the stepson to Albert Broccoli, the producer who brought James Bond Jr. to the screen. Michael also wrote several of the James Bond Jr. films, including For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill. He's also been a producer on the James Bond films since GoldenEye. Robbie London was one of the people that developed Captain Planet and one of the cartoon shows I remember watching as a kid growing up, The Wacky World of Tex Avery. The directors of this episode was Bill Hutton and Tony Love. Bill Hutton also directed other animated shows like the Police Academy animated series. Before that, he worked on the animation departments for the original Flintstone series, Lap Olympics, Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, Tiny Toon Adventures, and the Men in Black animated series. Tony Love directed shows like The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, Toxic Avengers, the animated series, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He also worked on the animation department for the first Flintstone animated movie called The Man Called Flintstone. He worked on the beginning credits of the film Revenge of the Pink Panther. He worked on the Jetsons, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure animated series, and the 90s Godzilla animated series. Writers on this episode, Andy Hayward, Francis Moss, and Ted Pedersen. I found this really interesting. Andy Hayward was also one of the creators of Inspector Gadget and also helped to create other Inspector Gadget shows like Gadget Boy and the most recent Inspector Gadget series. He also worked as a writer on Captain Planet. Francis Moss worked as a writer on She-Ra, Care Bears, Defenders of Earth, Ninja Turtles. Ted Pedersen also worked on Ninja Turtles. He also wrote on The Smurfs, Captain Planet, and another show I grew up watching as a kid, Mummies Alive. Not sure if a lot of people remember that show, but I remember watching it every morning as a kid. All right, so there's a quick behind the scenes of episode 1. Let's go into the episode. So it starts off and we see a farm road. We see 2 cars in a chase. One is James Bond Jr., the other is Scumlord. Scumlord in this show is the Blofeld of the series. He's also kind of a mixture of Dr. Claw and Doom from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Scumlord is the leader of the crime organization Scum, which is the equivalent of Spectre from the James Bond films. Scum stands for Saboteurs and Criminals United in Mayhem. We see Scumlord's car has a hidden blaster in the engine area, and it shoots towards James Bond Jr.'s car. Well, again, this is a James Bond car, so it's going to have all the gadgets. So we see a metal plate appear from the back, and it blocks the blast shots. Now, this might seem familiar to you if you're a James Bond fan, because James Bond used a very similar method to stop gunfire. James Bond Jr. then runs Scumlord's car off the road, making his getaway, and that's when he sees a truck whose ramp is at an angle. So he seizes the opportunity and he goes for it and he jumps right over the truck. Scumlord makes it out of the ditch and tries to do the same thing, but unfortunately he doesn't get the oomph and he just hits the haystacks that are in the back of the car. And that's when we get our first one-liner of the series from James Bond Jr. Pity they missed their flight. So much like how James Bond always had a quick one-liner in the movies, James Bond Jr. has similar type of one-liners in the show. James Bond Jr. thinks he's made it to safety, but out of nowhere we see 2 Scum motorbikes appear out of nowhere. That's when we get our second one-liner of the episode, "These Sunday drivers." James Bond Jr. is able to outmaneuver the motorcycles, causing them to crash, but he ends up getting onto a cliff and jumping off. Scumlord then parks his car off the cliff and watches as James Bond Jr. falls towards the ground. That's when Bond presses a button on the dash and a propeller pops out of the front of the car and he flies off to safety. We then cut to Warfield Academy, which is where James Bond Jr. and his friends go to school. We see the headmaster, Milbanks, talking to the students and mentioning that they have a new classmate who is running late. and he's not happy about this. All of a sudden, we hear this noise, and we see the Aston Martin zooming towards them. And that's when one of the students, Gordo Lighter, who we'll talk about in a little bit, yells out, "Whoa, that's an Aston Martin DB5. So as the car flies over them, James Bond Jr. does a sort of Ace Ventura type maneuver, spins the car around, parks perfectly into a parking space. Like a glove. That's when Mr. Milbanks is like, "Who is that? Who could that be?" And Buddy Mitchell, who is the school's gym teacher, goes, "Oh, I think that's the kid who's running tardy." And that's when James Bond Jr. introduced himself. "My name is Bond, James Bond Jr." That's how he introduced himself to everybody on the show, just like that. We then cut to James Bond Jr. and Buddy Mitchell in Mr. Milbanks' office, and Mr. Milbanks, again, he's not happy. He's not amused by this. He tells James Bond Jr. that he doesn't want this type of showing off at his school. So he tells James Bond Jr. that he is confined to the campus for the weekend, much to the dismay of James Bond Jr. Buddy shows him around campus where his dorm is, and that's when he mentions that him and his uncle, James Bond, are old friends. Apparently, Buddy Mitchell used to work for the FBI, and him and James Bond crossed paths here and there. Bond walks into his dorm room and he sees a big mess. There's a bunch of medical stuff there, test tubes, and he goes, "Oh, is this my dorm? This looks more like the science lab." And that's when we see another character on the show, IQ, appear. Now, IQ, of course, is the grandson of Q. IQ is holding this liquid in his hand, and he explains that it's some new exploding liquid material that he's created. Remember that because it comes back in the episode. IQ then takes Bond over to the kitchen area where he said he's invented a machine that can cook eggs in less than a minute. And of course, like all mad scientists in the 80s and 90s, his machine goes awry and it blows up and the eggs go all over them. And that's when we get our other one-liner in the episode. James Bond Jr. looks at IQ and says, "Well, the yoke's on us." Now, IQ, I would say he's sort of a cross between Doc Brown and MacGyver. You know, he's got kind of that zany, crazy doctor, but he also has the ability to turn anything into a gadget. IQ is showing James Bond Jr. around the campus, and that's when he shows him his other new invention that he's working on, a wristwatch that has a ton of gadgets on there. I mean, again, this is a very much James Bond type watch, and one of the gadgets on there is a missile launcher. We cut to the cafeteria and IQ introduces Bond to Gordo Lighter. Gordo Lighter, of course, is the surfer son of Felix Leiter, James Bond's friend, and Gordo is your typical California surfer dude. He's got the bleach blonde hair, he's into surfing, he's into skateboarding, he's got the shirt with the skull on it, he's got that surfer voice. Gordo introduced himself to James Bond Jr. He mentions that his dad and his uncle are friends, they've worked together, and that's when Gordo's like, "Well, I gotta go hang tide," or he says some sort of surfer term, I can't remember, and he takes his food tray and he starts sliding down the stairs, and that's when he runs into another character on the show, Tracy Milbanks, who is the daughter of the headmaster. Bond and IQ see this and they rush down the stairs, and Bond goes to help Tracy, and Tracy looks at him and goes, "Oh, you must be the new student my father was talking about." He goes, "Your father?" "Yes, my father is the headmaster, but don't think that that's going to give you some leeway." Bond kind of looks at her and, he says some little quip like, "Oh, it doesn't matter who your father is," They just pretty much is saying that she's very attractive and whatnot. But he's flirting with her, as Bonds do. It's then that we meet our final main character of the series, Phoebe. You're going to start noticing some things with this show that some of these characters might seem familiar to other animated characters. Phoebe is the Velma of the show, while Tracy is very much the Daphne of the show. And if you look at a lot of the writers who worked on James Bond Jr., you're going to see that their credits include several of the Scooby-Doo animated series. You might notice some crossover characteristics here and there. Phoebe sees Bond and she's automatically attracted to him. And we then meet another character. He's the snobby kid on campus, Trevor Noseworthy III. Again, he is your typical type of British stuck-up character. He kind of sounds like Jim Backus, who was the millionaire on Gilligan's Island. So he kind of pushes his way through and whatnot. We then cut to Scumlord watching James Bond Jr. from a mountaintop. He's watching the school, and he's there with Jaws. And again, you don't really ever see Scumlord's face. You kind of see an outline of a nose, a mouth, sunglasses. You never really see his characteristics. And much like how Blofeld had the white cat, Scumlord has a white dog. Him and Jaws are there watching James Bond Jr. and Scumlord mentions that he wants the Aston Martin because it contains a powerful electromagnetic pulse generator that he wants to use to wipe out all of England's computer system so Scum can take over England and then use the same machine to take over other nations. And Jaws is like, well, I'll go down there and I'll get the car. And Scumlord's like, no, I have someone else who's going to bring me the car. James Bond Jr. Now in this series, several of the voice actors voice multiple characters. Jeff Burnett voices IQ, but he also voices Scumlord. And Jan Rabson, who voices Gordo Lighter, voices Jaws. Jan is also known for voicing a popular video game character, Leisure Suit Larry. We then cut back to Warfield Academy, where we see Tracy going up to James Bond Jr. telling him that a package is waiting for him at the post office from his uncle. Well, of course, James Bond Jr. is really eager to see what his uncle has sent him, but he's not allowed to leave the campus. That's when he gets the help of Tracy and IQ to sneak him out. Tracy knows all the secret compartments that are on campus that her father doesn't know about, so she uses that to sneak her and Bond way off campus. When they make their way out, IQ is able to drive the Aston Martin to where they're at, and then they drive off to the post office. As they arrive to the post office, James Bond Jr. and IQ get out to go get the package while Tracy stays in the car. Well, as she's in the car waiting, she sees this big figure walking towards her. It's Jaws. As she watches Jaws walk towards her, she jumps in the back of the car to hide. Jaws opens the door, gets in, takes some of the wiring, bites it, and starts to hotwire the car. Around this time, James Bond Jr. and IQ realize there's no package, and IQ is like, why would someone call and tell you there's a package waiting for you when there's not? And that's when it starts to dawn on James Bond Jr., oh, this might be a trap. But before they can get to the car, Jaws has hotwired it and drove off. Bond and IQ see the car driving off, and Bond's like, oh no, they took the car, and Tracy's inside. Now stranded at the post office, IQ and James Bond Jr. call Gordo and Phoebe for help. Gordo has brought a box of a bunch of electronic parts for IQ to use, and that's when IQ finds a transmitter that his grandfather gave him that's able to track and control all of MI6's Aston Martins, which includes the one that James Bond Jr. has. So they use the homing signal to track the Aston Martin to an abandoned airfield. That's when James Bond Jr. notices a Scum cargo plane landing. And he realizes, oh, Scum is behind this. We gotta stop them. James Bond Jr. and IQ then exit the car. They see the Aston Martin being driven inside a large truck. James Bond Jr. and IQ exit their car, and that's when IQ gives James Bond Jr. the gadget watch and tells him that he's added some new stuff to it, like a mini buzzsaw. Now, what's interesting is that even though we see this buzzsaw, it's never used in this episode. It's kind of like, oh, it's there, but he never uses it. Bond tells IQ to use what's left of his exploding liquid and to pour it inside the truck's engine. Jaws and the driver put the truck with the car on the cargo plane. But as they're driving it toward the plane, the engine explodes. Jaws and the driver get out to check to see what's wrong, and that's when James Bond Jr. makes his run towards the back of the truck. He looks in the front of the Aston Martin, he looks in the back of it, he doesn't see Tracy, and that's when he pops open the trunk and sees that she's made her way back there to hide. As Bond starts getting her out of the truck, she starts saying, Jaws, Jaws, and he goes, what? And that's when Jaws appears behind them and grabs them both. They try to fight him, but obviously Jaws is a very powerful guy. I mean, he's like 7 feet tall, built like a brick house. He just tosses him in the back of the trunk and shuts it. And he tells him, get ready because we're about to go to Scum headquarters. He then goes to the cockpit, tells Scumlord that not only does he have Bond, but he has one of his friends as well. And that they're sitting fine in first class. So even Jaws makes jokes in this episode. Bond and Tracy are stuck in the trunk of the Aston Martin, and that's when James Bond Jr. remembers that his watch has that mini missile blaster on it. So he uses that and he blasts open the trunk of the car and they get out. James Bond Jr. goes over, he tries to turn on the flight navigation on the car because by this point they're thousands of feet up in the air. But unfortunately, the flight on the car no longer works. It got damaged. By this point, Jaws has heard some noise and he gets out and he sees that Bond and Tracy have escaped. So James Bond Jr. puts the car into drive and he rams right into the cockpit, throwing Jaws back, hitting the control panel, causing the plane to start to nosedive downward. Bond and Tracy are trying to figure out a way to get out of the plane when they see Jaws coming towards them again. So Bond is like, all right, here we go again. He puts it into drive, goes to hit Jaws, but this time he's ready and he grabs the front of the Aston Martin, lifts it up, and takes a big chunk out of the front bumper. By this time, James Bond Jr. and Tracy are like, nope, not today. James Bond Jr. grabs a parachute, tells Tracy to hold on, and they jump out of the plane. So now the plane is just nosediving towards the ground quickly. Scumlord grabs him and his dog and 2 parachutes and they bail. Jaws is standing there with no parachute and like, uh-oh, here we go. And he just jumps out of the plane and starts tumbling down. And he falls right into the roof of a barn and the whole thing just collapses on top of him. Now, of course, he's fine. Nothing's wrong with him. And this kind of mirrors similar situations that Jaws was put into in For Your Eyes Only and Moonraker, where a bunch of stuff falls on top of him and he comes off and just dusts his shoulders off and goes on his merry way. Back at Warfield Academy, Trevor is ready to snitch on James Bond Jr. to the headmaster. He's like, I haven't seen him all day and I'm pretty sure that he's not here. So they open the door to his dorm and who's there at the desk? James Bond Jr. doing his homework. Trevor's like, and Mr. Milbanks is not happy. He does not like troublemakers, and so he gives Trevor a week of detention. James Bond Jr. kind of laughs it off, and that's when he goes over to his window, and we see IQ holding a ladder, and James Bond Jr. is like, whew, right in the nick of time. Later on, Bond and his friends are reminiscing about the adventure they just had, and you find out that Buddy Mitchell knew about their little excursion outside of the academy, and he informs James Bond Jr. that the device that Scumlord was looking for was never in the Aston Martin. There was some misinformation on everybody's end. And of course, James Bond Jr. is upset because his car got blown up for nothing. But that's when Buddy tells him that his uncle got him a gift, a real gift. So he looks outside in the parking lot, and what does he see but a red sports car? And this is the car that you'll see throughout the series, and they even made it into an action figure vehicle. Now that I've talked about the first episode, I want to talk about issue number 1 of the Marvel comics of James Bond Jr., which is an adaptation of the first episode. Issue number 1 of James Bond Jr. was released on January 1992. Now, even though it's an adaptation, it does have its differences when it comes to scenes and even dialogue. Some of the changes in the comics I preferred over what was in the episode. The comic starts off in a farm road with a car chase between Bond and Scumlord, but instead of the whole motorcycle scenes or ramp, that's all cut out and we just see the blaster pop out of the hood of the car, Bond's car blocking it, James Bond Jr.'s car drive off a cliff, he presses the button, it becomes an airplane, he flies to safety. So even though they cut it down in the comics, it doesn't take away from the action. We then cut to Warfield Academy. What's different about this is that when the car goes over their head, there's no like, oh, that's an Aston Martin DB5. All that is cut. We just see the car fly over them. James Bond Jr. does his best Ace Ventura impression, parks the car in the parking space, gets out. Mr. Milbanks is like, who's causing all this disorder? It's me, Bond, James Bond Jr. Now here's where the comic begins to differ from the episode. The introduction between IQ and James Bond Jr. was James Bond Jr. entering the room and then Q following him. In the comics, IQ is already in there doing experiments, showing James Bond Jr. his exploding liquid, and that's when James Bond Jr. sees the watch on the desk and he presses the button which shoots the rocket out, causing an explosion. And then that's when Q gives him the watch. In the show, we see Trevor, he kind of just walks through the crowd. And they're like, oh, that's that's Trevor Noseworthy the third. It's a quick like, here he is, and there he goes. In the comic, he's like, get out of my way. The hallways are not a place for fraternization. And then Bond kind of looks at him and goes, I got a feeling he and I aren't going to get along very well. So the comic kind of lays out the groundwork of maybe Bond and Trevor won't get along, but in the episode, that's not really talked about. We don't see Tracy and Bond going through secret compartments. The comic just cuts to Tracy and Bond waiting for IQ to bring the Aston Martin. Now, in the show, IQ just drives up with the Aston Martin and then they drive off. In the comics, they say, oh, thanks IQ for bringing the car. And he goes, my pleasure, James, even though I've never driven a car before. So again, the comic seems to flesh out some of the background of the characters more. Now in the comic, it goes back and forth between the airplane and the characters on the ground, Gordo, Phoebe, and IQ. In the episode, once James Bond Jr. gets into the Aston Martin with Tracy, we really don't see the other characters on the ground anymore. So I like how the comic kind of shows you what the characters are doing outside of the airplane. What's their interaction, what's their feelings. So James Bond Jr. uses his watch to blow off the trunk, just like in the episode. They get in the car to use the airplane mode, and that's when they realize, oh, it doesn't work, and they see Jaws come out of the cockpit. Bond says a one-liner, I don't find the stewardess very attractive. The comic actually has a few more comedic one-liners that are not featured in the episode. I also want to talk about some of the advertisement that's in the comic because it's fun to look back at some of these old comics and see what was being advertised at the time. One of the advertisements is for the Bart Simpson Nintendo video games for the NES and the Game Boy, Bart vs. the World, Bart vs. the Space Mutants. Also, there's an advertisement for the Konami handheld video games that were very similar to the Tiger Electronic video games. One of the ones advertised is for the Ninja Turtle video game, which I actually own. I had it growing up as a kid and I recently just got it again. You have advertisements for the then new Dungeons and Dragons game. One of the advertisements I found really humorous was for the Captain Planet NES game. It was on the back of the comic book and it said, we took some of the worst garbage on TV and turned it into a great video game. Now, for anyone who's ever played Captain Planet on NES, you know that it's not a great video game. I mean, honestly, a lot of the games on NES that were adaptations of movies or cartoon shows were seldom very good, outside of maybe Ninja Turtles, which is actually another advertisement in here for the Game Boy. They have the Ninja Turtles 2 Back to the Sewers. On the next episode, we'll be talking about episode 2 of James Bond Jr. called Earthcracker, where the characters of Goldfinger and Oddjob are introduced. I'll also be talking about issue number 6 of the Marvel Comics, which is an adaptation of the episode. Again, if you want to see some of my James Bond Jr. merchandise that I own, you can check out my Instagram at Varnell Retro Vintage Collections. You can also see pictures of the other random things I have here in my office. I'm Brian Varnell for Varnell Retro and Vintage Collections, and remember, danger lurks within every shadow.